On the SAT, I'm really bad at rearranging sentences in the writing section. Any tips to improve? So this is in the writing test. You also see these on ACT English. These are these questions where you are told that you have to look at sentence 3 or something, and you need to know, should you keep it where it is, or should you move it before sentence 1 or after sentence 5 or anything like that. So it's all about rearranging sentences. So I do have a few tips for this. I go through this in more detail in the SAT writing course and ACT English bootcamp, which are available for free on my website, members.reasonprep.com, or you can see them on YouTube, but it's best results on my website. So you can get those courses. So some quick tips though for these. First thing you want to look for. First thing is you have to read the whole paragraph. So a lot of times students get tunnel vision with the sentence and they just focus too much on the sentence and not get a sense of the paragraph as a whole. So make sure you're reading the whole paragraph. You can't get away with, on either test really, just reading portions of the passages. You do have to read through the whole thing. You don't have to read through the whole passage before you go to the questions, but you do have to read through the whole thing as you go along. Second thing to look for is look for keywords or phrases in the question. Examples would be names, dates, titles, terms. So for example, if the sentence mentions a name, maybe it says Rogers. Rogers said this, Rogers said that. Most likely that sentence is going to have to come after the person's introduced. If they use a term like, I don't know, doesn't really matter, entanglement. So if they use a fancy term like entanglement and you want to know, and that's been defined elsewhere in the paragraph, well then probably this sentence is going to go after a definition of entanglement. If the sentence you're moving has a definition of something or introduces an idea, or if it says something like, this theory states, these are all clues telling you this sentence needs to be either before or after, depending on the case, other sentences in the paragraph. Another point is look for logical flow. And this is principle number 2. I talk about the 4 principles in my courses for rhetorical skills. You want to make sure that your choice flows with the sentences around it. So for example, look for transition words like however, for example. Well, or for example, look for transition words. Look for, what was the other thing I was going to say? Crap. Look for transition words and, yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that. Look for transition words. Oh, and chronology. So if it says something like then, blah, 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 you know this is part of a sequence of events. Make sure it fits the chronology. The final thing to look for is if you have to move the sentence, look at how the sentence interacts with its new neighbors. So if you're going to move a sentence to sentence 2's position, how does it interact with sentence 1 and sentence 3? You want to look at that flow with the immediate sentences around it, sentence 1 and sentence 3. So those are some general tips for these types of questions. Again, it applies not just to SAT, but also to ACT. And like I said, I go into a lot more detail in this in the courses, the SAT writing course and the ACT English. How come I always get grammar SAT questions wrong? Well, it's hard to say specifically in your case why you might be getting them wrong, beyond the fact that there are probably rules that you don't know or rules that you're just not as familiar with. And I think one of the things that gives students the most trouble, and this is true for the SAT and ACT, unlike the way we speak to each other, where we make grammatical mistakes all the time and no one cares, well, some people who care generally don't like them. They're kind of pedantic, but generally we make mistakes and we can understand each other perfectly. On the SAT and ACT, they're really strict. So they follow rules in ways that you maybe don't follow them in your speech or in even things you read. So part of it is knowing, okay, the SAT is going to be really strict and their sentences are going to be read extremely literally. So an example, this always seems to give students trouble. So here's an example of what I mean by this. So a sentence like this gives people trouble because if you read it one way, it seems fine. Doesn't seem like there's an error, but there actually is a big mistake with this, and it's very rule-based. Driving down the street, the red house came out of nowhere. Seems like it might be okay, but there's an error. This is called a misplaced modifier or a dangling modifier. The way the structure of the sentence is actually reading, if you read this literally, which you should on the SAT or ACT, is that the red house is driving down the street. That doesn't make any sense. Someone we don't know, this is actually a dangling modifier, not that it matters. We'll just call it a misplaced modifier. We don't know who is driving down the street. So how would we fix this? We would have to say something like this. Driving down the street, the family noticed the red house, or something like that. I mean, I've changed the meaning of the sentence a little bit, but this would be more correct than this. And this is what I mean by, you might read that first sentence and say it's fine, but it's that literal strict sense of the rules that you need to learn. So if you don't know the rules, check out my ACT English course / SAT writing course, available completely for free. They're on YouTube, they're on my website, and they teach you all the rules. Once you learn the rules, you'll see how it repeats again and again, and then you'll go from there. Question on ACT Science. Any tips on how to take apart a science passage on the ACT? Sometimes I feel like there's so much going on in a passage, it's hard to keep track of everything. So you've answered your question, essentially. There is too much going on in the passages, such that you can't keep track of everything. So don't. The goal for ACT science passages is to minimize the information that you're trying to absorb, that you're trying to work with. You do not, in most cases, need to understand absolutely everything with the passage or have a handle of everything. You only need to handle the things that they ask questions about. And so that's why my strategy, for example, for ACT Science is not to read any of the passages at all. Go right to the questions and use the questions as a way to determine, okay, what do I need to understand? What are they asking me about? What do I need to go and figure out and understand? Anything that they don't ask questions about, it's pointless. Don't need to worry about it. So the key here is not actually to try to figure everything out and keep track of everything. It's to focus on questions and use the questions as a frame by which you can analyze the passages, analyze the charts and figures, get answers. It's all about focusing on questions. It's the same thing in many ways with SAT reading and ACT reading. Use the questions. The questions are your friend. You get points for getting questions right, not for understanding the passage, right? I mean, it seems like there's not much of a distinction between them, but there is. If you perfectly understand a passage, you don't get any points for that. You get points for getting questions right. So always keep the focus on questions. Test 2, section number 2, question 8. So if you haven't done this SAT test yet, then you might want to not pay attention to this, but this is a specific grammar question. So for those of you who are having problems with SAT grammar, you'll get an idea of how I analyze a question like this. So the correct answer is D, but if you removed the underlined portion, wouldn't it be a comma splice? So what do we have here? While these classes are particularly helpful to young students developing basic research skills, but adult patrons can also benefit from librarian assistance in that they can acquire job-relevant computer skills. So no, this would not be a comma splice because this is all about sentence structure. This opening part of the sentence is what's called a subordinate, or AKA dependent clause. And as such, because it's dependent on a complete sentence. The only time you get comma splices is when you have a comma separating two complete sentences. This is a non-complete sentence, it's dependent. The sentence that follows when you get rid of the but is an independent clause. So structurally, in fact, you cannot have any what's called a coordinating conjunction separating these two things at all. So no and, no but, no for. So immediately, this is an example of, we were talking before about grammar, it's recognizing structure. So this word that connects these two sentences, once you know this is dependent, this is independent, the structure you know is separate them with a comma and a comma only. So right away, boom, 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 A, B, and C are gone, and you pick D. So it's all about knowing structure. There's nothing subjective about this. This is not a matter of opinion. This is not a matter of taste. It's a matter of knowing the rules, recognizing structure, and then picking the choice based on that. That versus those for SAT grammar. You don't see this too often. The one place you would see this on the SAT is with what are called comparison errors. And the main thing, and I'll show you an example of this in a second, but the main difference that you need to know for that versus those is that is singular, those is plural. So if these are pronouns, and pronouns are all about what's called pronoun agreement. Whether they're targeting a noun that's singular or plural, they have to agree. They have to match. So if you're talking about the book, you would say that or that book because it's one book. If you're talking about multiple books, you would say those books, right? Not that books. So it's all about singular versus plural. Now, where on the SAT would this come up? So this would come up, and we'll try something a little bit different. I'm going to try to experiment with something. I'm going to put a question on the screen, and I want you all to, in chat, reply with your answers, what you think. If you want, you don't have to. Reply with what you think might be wrong, what might be the right answer for this. So let me come up with a question here. All right, so here are our choices. I'll give you all a minute to figure out what you think is the right answer, and then we'll talk about it. So if you want to say in chat what you think it is, that's cool. Or not, I will give you the answer in a little bit anyway. Okay, pretty good consensus in chat. Looks like C is the consensus, and that is the right answer. So this gets to the core of the question. Why is it C? Why is it not the others? This is a comparison error. The original sentence is comparing the analysis of the job market to just the financial market. We have to compare like to like, analysis to analysis. So the reason why C works is that of singular is basically pointing to the analysis and is standing in for it. So you also, and there's other ways to have this be right. You could say is more thorough than the analysis of the financial market, or then the financial markets analysis, or even then the financial markets apostrophe S. A lot of possible corrections. This is the most common. Use that of. So the original is a comparison error. B is better, except just like we talked about before, those is plural. We need this to be singular to point to analysis. And then D is just super wordy. It gets rid of the then, which we do want as a comparison. So we don't like D. So we go with choice C. Okay, so let's do this question. Again, if you haven't seen this test, this is test 6, official SAT. I recommend not watching this. Or you can kind of like not listen to me and try it on your own first if you want to do that. So how many liters of a 25% saline solution must be added to 3 liters of a 10% saline solution to obtain a 15%? So for those of you who just want a formula, if a question like this ever comes up again, let me give you a formula. And that is the percent of the first one times the volume of the first one plus the percent of the second one times the volume of the second one must equal the sums, or we'll do this way, must equal the percent of the total mixture times the sum of the volumes. So this is a formula you can use for any questions where you want to have, where you have mixtures and you want to find like how much of one you need to create a mixture of such and such. As a side note, if you've done chemistry, questions like these are a lot easier. If you haven't, yeah, they're a lot more painful. So we can just plug in our numbers here. So the percent of the first one, so we'll make that 25%. And you can make this 0.25 or 25, it's the same. Liters would be X, that's what we're looking for. The percent of the second one is 10, and we've got 3 liters of that. The total percent we want is 15. And the volumes added up are X for the first one plus 3. And so I'm not going to go ahead and solve this, but if you go ahead and solve this, you'll get the answer, which I believe was 1.5. And so that's a formula you could use if you don't want to worry about where this comes from. In terms of how you can do this without a formula, basically it breaks down like this. We want to create a ratio, saline on top and total volume on bottom, that ends up equaling 15%. In other words, 15 over 100, or we can just say 0.15. So I need to know what is my total saline that I have in my mixtures and what is my total volume overall. Well, total volume is easy. We know it's 3 plus X, X being the volume of the 25% solution, which we don't know. How much saline do we have? Well, in the case of the 3 liters of a 10% solution, that's saline, 10% of 3, or 0.1 times 3, is going to be the amount of saline in that solution. For the one that we don't know, how many liters of 25% solution, that's got to be 0.25% times x, because again, x is what we're looking for. And you'll actually see if you rearrange this, you get this equation out of this. But that's kind of the justification for where this equation comes from. And again, if you cross multiply and solve for x, you'll get the answer. So really tricky. Unfortunately, I've been trying to think, like, is there an easy way that I've missed that makes this problem really easy? And unfortunately, I just don't think that there is an easier way to do this. So those are 2 ways to do it. If you have any others, feel free to leave a comment in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube later, or leave a comment in chat. And yeah, if there's anything easier. But those are 2 ways. You can memorize this formula in case this comes up again, or this one. This kind of reasoning may perhaps make sense to you. What's a good resource to learn how to do the more advanced ACT math questions? Because I never learned anything in school due to people not paying attention and slowing the classes down massively. So the first thing I would say is you should only really worry about this if you're going for 30 plus. And I know your ultimate goal maybe is 30 plus, but if you're scoring, let's say, a 22 right now or 25, worrying about the hard questions in the numbers 51 to 60, which is basically where they show up, is not a priority. So it really depends on your situation. For most people, learning this stuff is not important, or at least not yet important. However, if you're already in the high 20s or low 30s and you want to go higher, then you should worry about this. That said, it's a little bit tricky. So topics that would fall under this would be things like matrices, vectors, complex numbers, combinations and permutations. Little topics that you may not have, some statistical stuff, stuff that you may have never been addressed or maybe only looked at briefly. It's tough because it's so hard to find good material on this. My courses cover it a little bit, but I can't go into the depth that you would get into it in a math class. The videos would just be way too long. So Khan Academy might be a place to start, not their SAT section, obviously, but just their regular math algebra 2 pre-calc section. Might be somewhat overkill, but this is why it's hard. It's hard to, like, if you take vectors, for example, or no, combinations and permutations. Most of what you would learn in like an algebra 2 on combinations and permutations or pre-calc won't be on the test. So it's finding that balance between learning enough but not learning too much that's so tricky. And I mean, Khan Academy might be one way to do it if you don't go overboard with it. This is where it gets tricky. Prep books, maybe, if their content review is good, but often it's not. What I like to do is just Google worksheets. So I'll Google like vector worksheets after maybe learning something on Khan Academy. But I don't know, honestly, I don't have a great answer to this because they're so rare. It's like another example would be logs. The thing with logs is it's pretty standard in most classes. You may have learned it or may have not, but maybe only learned it briefly. But like you only see log questions once every 2 or 3 tests. So it's like, do you want to spend a day learning logs for one question that may not even appear? I don't know. It's tough. Again, this is why it's important only to do this when you're shooting for that 30 plus score and when you're already pretty close to it. So Khan Academy, prep books, I would look and see what their content review looks like. My ACT Math Bootcamp covers these advanced topics. So check out my site, ACT Math Bootcamp. I do cover these advanced topics. Some are like the core basics of them, which may help because you only need to know the core basics. So that might be enough. So hopefully that helps, but it's a difficult problem, and it's definitely an area that needs to be addressed. And I would love to be able to do it if I had the time. Taking it this Saturday. Any last minute tips or advice? Key concepts. Main thing is, again, I can only be really broad here because I don't know specifically. There's a lot of things we can talk about for each of the sections, but I'll give something that's pretty general that helps really for any of the sections. And that's read the answers carefully. But also, more importantly, what people don't often do is make sure you check all the choices, especially in reading and writing. Too often, students kind of once they find an answer they think is right, they pick it and they move on. Check all 4 choices, especially in reading and writing, because you may find, oh, I thought B was good, but then I checked D and D looks good, and now you have to make a choice between the two and maybe reevaluate what you thought about B. So check all the choices. Don't just find one that works and go, hooray, and pick it and move on. Be thorough. And of course, there's a balance here between thoroughness and time. and you got to strike that balance. I think most students err too much on the time balance, trying to rush to finish it. You'll generally get better results by slowing down, being more thorough and deliberate as you work through the test. And as I talk about elsewhere, skipping questions that seem hard or time consuming, moving on, banking your easy points and coming back to hard questions later. That's essentially the workflow. One other thing as well, this is often overlooked by by students, reread the questions. So important. I would say a good chunk of the time students get stuck or they get a question wrong, whether it's math, reading, or writing, is they don't read the questions carefully enough. And so that happens sometimes. What you should do when you're stuck on a question, no matter the section, is don't just dwell on the choices or dwell on the math or dwell on the passage. Reread the question and really focus. The question is designed very carefully. The wording of the question matters. So reread the question. A lot of times you might notice something that you didn't notice at first, and that can make a big difference. In planning maintenance for a city's infrastructure, a civil engineer estimates that starting from the present, the population of the city will decrease by 10% every 20 years. If the present population of the city is 50,000, which of the following represents this engineer's estimate of the population 2 years from now? So this is all about knowing the structure of these exponentials and what goes where. And the first thing is what number goes in here. Very important. This is going to be 1 plus the percent as a decimal if it's an increase, or 1 minus the percent as a decimal. So since this is decreasing by 10% or 0.1, what must be in the parenthesis is 0.9. So right away, A and B are gone. We're down to C and D. So now it's the other difference here is going to be what's in the exponent. And the way I think about this is, let's imagine we want T to be 20. Because every 20 years, this goes down by 10%. So we should be applying 1.9 for every 20 years. So what would happen if T is 20? This would end up being 0.9 to the 400. This would be 0.9 to the 1. What makes more sense? We would apply 400 sequential 10% declines for 20 years. That is just absurd. Or that we would apply 10% decline for that 20-year period. 1, obviously. So we would go with D. So plugging in numbers, thinking about what value this should return for given inputs of T can help you figure out what goes up here. Yeah. And so that would be the answer. So basically, to answer your question generally, break it down. Don't look at it as a whole. Look at first what's in the parenthesis. How does that correspond to the percent change? And then look at your exponent and see what makes sense if I made T20, or if I made T10, or T5, or T1, or whatever it might be. So I have a question. Okay, so let me address this in the chat or in the live stream, because this is a common thing I get. So any way you can get the most common idioms together in a video or document to help students for the writing section of the SAT. English is not my first language. Yeah, so the whole idiom/diction word choice questions. The answer to this, unfortunately, is going to be no. And it's not because I don't want to. I wish I could. But it's just kind of an impossible goal. And even if I could, I don't think it would be helpful. Because if you think about English, there's like, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands of idioms. There's no way we can know what ones are going to appear. We know what idioms have appeared previously, but almost by definition, that almost means they'll never appear on future tests. Why would they reuse them? So what do I do then? Do I just go through all of English and create an idiom list? It doesn't seem very useful. And also, spending your time, I honestly can't think of anything more painful or brutal. Well, that's a bit exaggerated. I can't think of many things more intellectually unpleasant than having to study lists of idioms. That just sounds awful. Life is more than studying lists of idioms. So even if I could, I don't think you'd want to use it. And most of all, there's really only 1 to 2 of these per test. And you could also get a lot of them right either by guessing or by knowing them anyway. So the possible gain you can get out of an idiom or a diction list, you put diction together, then that's like another 1 to 2 questions. So maybe like 2 to 4 per test are in this category. The possible gain, I think, is so minimal for the time investment that I just don't think it's worth it. You can get a really good writing score just by focusing on the other questions and doing your best that you can on the idioms. If you Google like SAT idioms, you'll find stuff. I don't recommend using it. It doesn't seem very useful to me at all. So I would skip that. Well, solving practice tests. improve the score, especially in the reading section. So solving a test, then checking it thoroughly will increase my score. Or is there any other thing? So for reading in particular, that is the main activity, and really the only activity. Certainly longer term, you can read, right? You read all kinds of stuff. I've got a reading list on my website that you might want to check out if any of you haven't seen it. But in the short term, yeah, all you can do is do tests, and then most importantly, as you mentioned here, check every question, even the ones you get right, because sometimes you can get stuff right for wrong reasons. The reading section also really benefits from tutoring, or if that's not possible, you can't get help from a tutor or a teacher or a course, then working with friends to correct each other and reason it out with each other. The reading is the most intensive, labor-intensive section, and it's the one that increases the least, generally speaking, because reading is, to be like, I use this analogy all the time. It's not exact, but it's similar. It's like if I wanted, I don't speak French. Let's say I wanted to take the French equivalent of the SAT, which had a reading section. Would there be any tips that would save me? Is there any shortcuts? No, I have to learn the language. And then once I learn the language, I have to do a lot of reading, and more reading, and more reading, and more reading to gain that skill. So it's not really a short-term project. Now, that's an exaggeration, right? All of you here are English speakers to some degree. But the analogy is still apt, because you can't suddenly get better at reading in 2 weeks. It's a process. You're not going to be like, when I go through reading, like for example, reading passages to me, the reading test is generally easy. Is it because I'm like a brilliant reader? I'm pretty good, but it's because I'm 32 and I did my full high school career. I went to Cornell for my bachelor's, Cornell for my master's. I almost did a PhD, and I've studied SAT to prep for this for 6 years. Of course, it's easy to me, right? It's not comparable. So it's all a function of the time and effort you put into it. So certainly, doing practice tests, reviewing them is key, and then if you've got the time, doing consistent reading, outside reading, paying attention in English class, all that stuff, it adds up over time. So yeah, but definitely in the short term, reading and then reviewing your questions, reviewing your answers is absolutely critical.